Could Africa finally be shaking off France's influence for good? France's historical ties with African nations run deep, a complex web of colonialism, cultural exchange, and economic interests that have shaped the continent for centuries. Today, many African countries are still grappling with the legacy of French colonial rule, and the question on everyone's mind is, has the time finally come for Africa to break free from France's grip? The relationship between France and Africa has been a tumultuous one, marked by periods of brutal oppression, cultural suppression, and economic exploitation. Many African nations gained independence in the mid-20th century, but the ties that bind them to their former colonial masters remain strong, with France still exerting significant control over their economies, politics, and even military affairs. But times are changing, and Africa is slowly but surely reclaiming its sovereignty. From calls for reparations to demands for greater autonomy, African nations are pushing back against France's influence, and it's an exciting time to be alive. So what does this new era of African independence look like, and how is France responding to these changes? The history between France and Africa is long and complex, but to understand where we are today, we need to take a step back and examine the roots of French colonialism in Africa. The concept of franco-afrique, a term coined by French writer François-Xavier Verschave, refers to the network of French business, political and military interests that have dominated African affairs since the colonial era. French colonialism was characterized by brutal exploitation, forced labor and cultural suppression, with African cultures and languages erased from the curriculum in favor of French. The legacy of this trauma still lingers, with many African nations struggling to rebuild their cultural identities and assert their independence. One of the most significant outcomes of French colonialism was the creation of the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries that is still pegged to the euro. This has led to accusations of economic imperialism, with France exerting significant control over the monetary policies of its former colonies. The era of franco-afrique is slowly coming to an end, however, as African nations begin to assert their independence and challenge French dominance. From Burkina Faso to Guinea, African leaders are taking a stand against French interference, and it's an exhilarating time for Pan-Africanism. Recent movements for independence have been marked by widespread protests and demonstrations, with Africans taking to the streets to demand greater autonomy and an end to French interference. In Burkina Faso, for example, protests against the CFA franc led to the ousting of President Blaise Compaoré, a close ally of France. Former Guinea President Alpha Condé was actively pursuing an anti-French agenda, calling for greater economic sovereignty and an end to French dominance. Meanwhile, in Mali, the government has been working to reduce its reliance on French military aid, opting instead for greater regional cooperation and sovereignty. But economic changes are also driving the shift towards African independence. With China and other emerging economies increasingly investing in Africa, the continent is no longer as dependent on French economic aid as it once was. This new landscape of economic possibilities has given African nations the confidence to assert their independence and push back against French influence. While the tide is slowly turning in favor of African independence, there are still significant challenges ahead. France's ongoing influence in certain areas, such as security and defense, remains a major hurdle to true independence. One of the most significant counter-arguments to the idea of Africa breaking free from France's grip is the complexity of independence itself. Many African nations still rely heavily on French economic aid, and the process of decolonization is a messy and complicated one. Moreover, the ongoing influence of France in certain areas, such as security and defense, means that true independence is still a long way off. The presence of French military bases in several African countries, for example, remains a contentious issue, with many arguing that it undermines African sovereignty. So what does the future hold for Africa and its relations with France? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: the era of franco-afrique is slowly coming to an end, and a new era of African sovereignty is emerging. What do you think about the current state of Africa-France relations? Do you think Africa is finally breaking free from France's grip? Let us know in the comments below.